I have sentenced people who lost millions. I have watched wealthy executives, celebrities, business owners, and career criminals stand before me, believing money could solve problems that honesty could not. Most of them eventually discovered the same thing. A courtroom has no interest in your bank account. It only cares about your evidence. But one case has stayed with me longer than almost any other. Not because the amount of money involved was extraordinary, not because one of the parties belonged to one of the wealthiest families in America, and not because the courtroom was filled with reporters before I even walked through the doors. I remember it because of seven words spoken with complete confidence. A woman looked directly at me, smiled as though I were wasting her afternoon, and said, "Judge, you're completely clueless." The entire courtroom froze. Even experienced attorneys stopped writing. The bailiff slowly turned toward her. No one expected anyone to speak to a judge that way. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't emotional. She genuinely believed I had misunderstood the case. The surprising part. For almost 20 minutes, she actually convinced everyone else she might be right. Believe me, there are moments when a courtroom becomes dangerous. Not because people are shouting, but because a lie is so polished that it almost sounds reasonable. This was one of those moments, and by the end of that hearing, the woman who called me clueless couldn't even look me in the eye. Before we go any further, make sure you have subscribed to this channel for more powerful courtroom stories like this one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Also, comment below and tell us where you are watching this video from. Now, let me take you back to where this case truly began. The plaintiff was a man named Noah Bennett, 34 years old, former private pilot, recently unemployed, married, father of 2 daughters. When he entered my courtroom, he carried a worn leather binder that had clearly been opened hundreds of times. Some people organize evidence because lawyers tell them to. Others organize it because they know no one else is coming to save them. Noah belonged to the second group. Across the courtroom sat Victoria Ashcroft, 46 years old, elegant, perfect posture, designer suit that probably cost more than Noah earned in several months. She wasn't famous. Her husband was. Richard Ashcroft had built one of the largest logistics companies on the East Coast. Private jets, luxury estates, magazine covers, business awards, the kind of wealth that attracts attention before a single word is spoken. Interestingly, Richard wasn't the defendant, Victoria was. And throughout the hearing, she behaved as though the courtroom belonged to her. Years on the bench teach you something fascinating. Real confidence is usually quiet. Inherited confidence often isn't. Victoria smiled at nearly everyone who spoke, not warmly, dismissively. She looked at Noah the way some people glance at old furniture waiting to be replaced. That bothered me immediately. Not because of her wealth. I've seen honest billionaires and dishonest people with $10 in their pockets. Money has never impressed me. Character has. The lawsuit involved a rare vintage aircraft. A beautifully restored 1968 Beechcraft that Noah had spent almost 11 years rebuilding with his late father. According to Noah, Victoria convinced him to lease the aircraft temporarily for a charity aviation gala hosted by the Ashcroft Foundation. The agreement was straightforward. The aircraft would appear for one weekend. No passengers, no commercial use, no modifications. It would then be returned in exactly the same condition. Instead, it disappeared for 19 days. When it finally came back, the engine hours had increased dramatically. Critical navigation equipment had been replaced. Several original restoration components were missing. And according to Noah, the aircraft his father helped rebuild would never again be completely original. Interesting, very interesting. Victoria smiled, actually smiled. then leaned toward her attorney and whispered something that made both of them laugh. I noticed years on the bench teach you to pay attention when someone laughs before the evidence has even been discussed. People usually laugh because they believe they already know how the story ends. I looked toward Victoria. Do you dispute possessing the aircraft longer than agreed? No. Do you dispute additional flight hours? No. Do you dispute replacing original components? She smiled again. No. The spectators exchanged confused looks. Even Noah looked surprised. Because if all of that was true, what exactly was the defense? Victoria folded her hands, calm, confident, then she spoke. Judge, you're looking at this like someone who doesn't understand how real business works. Interesting. Very interesting. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. I improved his aircraft. I increased its value. I did him a favor. She paused, then looked directly at me. And honestly, I think you're completely clueless if you can't see that. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The words hung in the courtroom like smoke. I didn't respond immediately. Experience teaches patience, especially when someone believes they've just won the room. So instead, I quietly reached for the very last page inside Noah's binder, a page he hadn't mentioned, a page neither attorney had discussed, a page that contained one handwritten sentence from someone who had inspected that aircraft just 48 hours earlier. I read it once, then again, and honestly, the moment I finished reading, I realized Victoria had absolutely no idea what was about to happen next. The moment I reached the final page in Noah Bennett's binder, I noticed something unusual. It wasn't written on company letterhead. It wasn't an expert report. It wasn't even typed. It was a single handwritten note attached to the inspection file with a paperclip. Years on the bench teach you never to ignore handwritten notes. People often write the truth before they have time to polish it. The courtroom remained silent. Victoria Ashcroft leaned back confidently. She had no idea what I was reading. Her attorney looked relaxed. Noah sat quietly, his hands folded together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He wasn't watching Victoria. He was watching me, not with hope, with uncertainty. Almost as if he still believed that money might defeat evidence. That observation stayed with me a lot. I read the handwritten sentence again, then looked up. Mr. Bennett, who wrote this? Noah answered immediately. Arthur Collins. And who is Mr. My father? The courtroom became noticeably quieter. I looked back down at the page. But according to your testimony, your father passed away 3 years ago. Yes, Your Honor. Interesting. Very interesting. Now, the room was paying attention. Noah slowly explained the note wasn't recent. It had been written 11 years earlier during the aircraft's restoration. His father had hidden small handwritten inspection notes throughout the maintenance records to remind future mechanics of details that couldn't be found in technical manuals. Interesting, very interesting. The spectators leaned forward. One sentence immediately caught my attention. Arthur Collins had written, "Never replace this original gyro unless it fails completely. Once removed, this airplane loses part of its history." The courtroom remained silent. Victoria's smile faded. Only slightly, I continued reading. The note identified a very specific navigation instrument. A rare factory-installed directional gyro manufactured in 1968, no longer produced, no longer available. Interesting. Very interesting. I looked toward Noah. Was that instrument replaced? Yes. Were you consulted first? No. The answer came without hesitation. Then I turned toward Victoria. Did you authorize replacing the original gyro? She answered confidently. Of course. It was outdated. Interesting. Very interesting. Who recommended replacing it? Our aviation consultant. Do you have that recommendation? A pause. My office probably does. Interesting answer. Very interesting. Years on the bench teach you that people who actually possess important documents usually bring them. People who don't promise they'll appear later. That distinction mattered a lot. Then Noah quietly handed me another folder, smaller than the others. Inside was a restoration appraisal completed only 6 months before the charity event. Interesting, very interesting. I reviewed the highlighted section. The appraiser specifically listed the original 1968 directional gyro as one of the aircraft's most valuable historical features, not because it improved performance, because it preserved authenticity. The report estimated that removing it would reduce the collector value of the aircraft substantially. Interesting, very interesting. I looked directly at Victoria. Had you reviewed this appraisal before accepting the aircraft? No. Were you given a copy? Yes. The courtroom became silent. You received it, but never read it. Victoria hesitated, then smiled again. I own several aircraft. I don't read every appraisal. Interesting answer, very interesting, because confidence was beginning to replace accuracy. Agon. Years on the bench teach you that experience does not excuse carelessness. If anything, it demands greater responsibility. Then Noah quietly spoke. Your Honor, I almost didn't file this lawsuit. Interesting, very interesting. Why? Because I knew who her husband was. The room became completely still. I assumed nobody would believe me. That sentence lingered longer than any legal argument. I've seen that look before, the look of someone who believes power has already chosen a side. It is one of the saddest expressions a judge can witness, because courts exist for exactly those moments. I asked Noah why he changed his mind. He reached into his binder, removed a small envelope, yellowed with age, carefully folded. Interesting, very interesting. This belonged to my father. Inside was a handwritten letter, not addressed to me, not addressed to any court. It was written to Noah years before his father died. The last paragraph was underlined in blue ink. It read, "If someone ever tells you that money makes them more important than your honesty, let the truth do the arguing." The courtroom fell completely silent. Even Victoria stopped moving. Then she laughed. Actually laughed. She looked directly toward Noah, then toward me, and with complete confidence she said, "A touch story, but stories don't beat billionaires." The spectators gasped. I didn't respond. Not yet, because at that exact moment, the bailiff quietly placed a sealed package on my bench. It had arrived late. Overnight courier. From a company neither side had mentioned all morning, the manufacturer of the original aircraft instruments. And according to the documents inside, someone had been trying very hard to locate the missing gyro after it disappeared. Someone who had already discovered exactly where it went. The moment the bailiff placed the overnight package on my bench, the atmosphere inside the courtroom changed. Not because either attorney recognized the sender. They didn't, because Victoria did. For the first time that morning, she stopped smiling before I had even opened it. Years on the bench teach you to watch reactions before evidence is introduced. Sometimes a person's face tells you more than the document ever will. The courtroom remained silent. I examined the envelope. It wasn't from a law firm. It wasn't from an aviation insurer. It came from Heritage Flight Instruments, a company specializing in restoring rare aircraft components no longer in production. Interesting, very interesting. I opened the package. Inside were photographs, technical reports, shipping manifests, and a certified letter signed by the company's president. I began reading. The room became so quiet that the sound of the paper turning echoed across the courtroom. The letter explained that Heritage Flight Instruments had spent nearly 6 months trying to locate an original 1968 directional gyro matching the exact serial range of Noah Bennett's aircraft. Interesting. Very interesting plaque directs across the country had been searching for one. Museums wanted one. Private restorers wanted one. The market had become so competitive that original units were selling for astonishing prices. I looked toward Noah. Did you know that? He nodded. My father told me never to sell it. Interesting. Very interesting. Then I reached the second page. This is where everything changed. The company had attached a copy of a recent service request. A customer had contacted them asking whether an original 1968 gyro could be authenticated before resale. Interesting. Very interesting. The spectators leaned forward. I continued reading. The serial number submitted for authentication matched the serial number from Noah's maintenance records. Exactly. Not similar, not close. Exact. The courtroom froze. Dabblissal silence. I slowly looked toward Victoria. She no longer looked amused. She looked confused, or perhaps concerned. Years on the bench teach you that there is an enormous difference between those two expressions. One comes from not understanding. The other comes from realizing someone else does. I asked calmly, Miss Ashcroft, can you explain why Mr. Bennett's original instrument was submitted for authentication after it disappeared from his aircraft? A long pause followed. Then she answered, I have no idea. Interesting. Very interesting. Did anyone working for you remove the original gyro? Our maintenance contractor handled the aircraft. Interesting answer. Very interesting. Notice what had changed. Earlier, she proudly claimed responsibility for improving the aircraft. Now, responsibility belonged to someone else. That observation mattered a lot. Then Noah quietly stood. Your Honor, I recognize that service request. Interesting, very interesting. How? The email address. I looked more closely. The authentication request listed a contact email, Siable Professional. One I hadn't paid much attention to. Then Noah explained. That's the private email of Victoria's personal aviation manager. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Victoria immediately turned toward her attorney, not toward me, not toward Noah, toward her attorney. Years on the bench teach you something fascinating. People don't look toward their lawyers when evidence helps them. They look when they suddenly need help. Then I asked Victoria a simple question. Who authorized your aviation manager to remove components from Mr. Bennett's aircraft? She answered carefully this time. I don't know whether anything was removed. Interesting. Very interesting. Only 30 minutes earlier, she openly admitted replacing the gyro. Now, she wasn't sure anything had been removed at all. That contradiction did not escape anyone in the courtroom. Then I opened another photograph inside the package. It showed the missing gyro. Cleaned, rettered, dyed on a workbench. A small identification tag hung from the side. The serial number was perfectly visible. Interesting. Very interesting. I compared it with Noah's restoration records. Match. Perfect match, the spectators whispered. The bailiff immediately restored order. Then I reached the final page. This was the moment I realized the case was no longer about a restored airplane, because attached to the authentication request was something no one expected, an asking price, $185,000. The courtroom erupted. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Even Noah looked stunned. He wasn't surprised the gyro had value. He was shocked by how much. I looked back toward Victoria. She finally spoke. I've never seen that listing. Interesting. Very interesting. Maybe she hadn't. Maybe she had. At that moment, I genuinely didn't know. Years on the bench teach you never to assume guilt simply because the situation looks suspicious. Evidence must lead the way, always. Then the courtroom doors opened. Everyone turned A man in his late 50s entered carrying another sealed case. He wasn't on either witness list. He wasn't an attorney. He walked directly to the witness stand, showed identification to the bailiff, and quietly introduced himself. "My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm the aviation manager Mrs. Ashcroft just mentioned." He looked toward Victoria, then toward me, and the very first sentence out of his mouth made the entire courtroom stop breathing. "Your Honor, I need to correct something before anyone else testifies." The moment Daniel Mercer took the witness stand, I noticed Victoria Ashcroft stop breathing for just a second, not literally. But years on the bench teach you to recognize the subtle changes people cannot control. Her shoulders stiffened, her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. And for the first time that entire morning, she looked genuinely uncertain. That interested me immediately, because uncertainty had been completely absent from her demeanor until now. The courtroom remained silent. Daniel Mercer stood straight gray suit, no expensive watch, no dramatic entrance. Just a leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm and the expression of a man who had spent several sleepless nights deciding whether to tell the truth. I asked him to state his occupation. "I've managed private aircraft for the Ashcroft family for nearly 12 years. "Interesting. Very interesting. 12 years? "Yes, Your Honor." "So you were responsible for coordinating maintenance on the aircraft used by the Ashcroft family?" "Yes." "Were you involved with Mr. Bennett's Beechcraft?" "I was." Victoria shifted in her chair. Her attorney immediately leaned toward her. They whispered for several seconds. I waited. Experience has taught me never to rush moments like these. Silence has a way of making people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people often make mistakes. When the whispering ended, Victoria looked back at me with her confidence partially restored. "I assume he's here to explain that everything we did increased the airplane's value." Daniel slowly turned toward her. His expression never changed. "No, ma'am." The courtroom froze, dominoed silence. He wasn't angry. He wasn't emotional. He simply answered with complete certainty, "No, ma'am." That single sentence changed the atmosphere more than any dramatic speech could have. I asked him to continue. Daniel opened his portfolio and removed a maintenance checklist. The paper was covered with handwritten notes, dates, part numbers, inspection initials, fuel quantities. Everything an experienced aviation manager would record. Interesting, very interesting. I personally inspected Mr. Bennett's aircraft before it left for the charity gala and afterward. Yes. Were the original instruments still installed before departure? They were, and afterward, they were gone. The spectators leaned forward. I noticed several reporters stop writing. They were simply listening now. That rarely happens, Daniel continued. I immediately questioned the maintenance contractor. "What did they tell you?" "They said they were following instructions." "Interesting, very interesting." "Whose instructions?" A pause. Daniel looked toward Victoria, then toward me. "I was told the decision came from Mrs. Ashcroft's office." The room exploded into whispers. The bailiff immediately called for order. Again and again. Victoria stood up. "That's completely false." I calmly raised my hand. "Sit down." She hesitated, then slowly sat. Years on the bench teach you something fascinating. People interrupt testimony most often when they already know what the next sentence will be. That observation stayed with me a lot. I turned back to Daniel. "Did anyone explain why the original gyro was removed?" "Yes." "What reason were you given?" Daniel opened another folder. Inside was an internal work authorization. Company logo, maintenance request number, Aproval signature. Everything appeared authentic. He handed it to the bailiff. I reviewed the first page, then the second. The authorization stated, Asterisk, replace obsolete flight instruments with modern equipment for executive presentation. Interesting, very interesting executive presentation, not safety, not mechanical failure. Presentation. I looked toward Daniel. What does that mean? He answered without hesitation. The aircraft was scheduled to be displayed beside several corporate jets during the charity gala. The organizers believed modern avionics would photograph better for sponsors. The courtroom became perfectly still. I looked toward Victoria. So the original equipment wasn't replaced because it failed. No, it wasn't replaced because it was unsafe. No, it was replaced because someone believed newer instruments looked more impressive. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Then Daniel quietly said something that no one expected. That wasn't the part that bothered me. Interesting. Very interesting. What bothered you? The original gyro wasn't placed in secure storage. I looked up immediately. Where was it placed? Daniel swallowed. I don't know. You don't know? No, Your Honor, because when I returned the following Monday, it was already gone. The courtroom became silent once again. Gone, not stored, not cataloged. Gone. Years on the bench teach you that valuable property doesn't simply disappear. Somebody always knows where it went. The only question is whether they're willing to admit it. Then Daniel reached into the very bottom of his portfolio. He removed a small black notebook. Unlike the maintenance records, this wasn't company property. It was his personal notebook. I started writing things down after I realized something wasn't right. Interesting, very interesting. Inside were dates, conversations, meeting notes, pawn numbers, every entry written by hand. I flipped through several pages. Then one sentence caught my attention immediately, written 3 days after the charity gala. Asterisk, Victoria said, "Don't tell Noah about the original instrument until we know what it's worth." The courtroom froze. Nobody moved. Victoria's attorney immediately stood. "Objection!" I looked at him calmly. "On what basis?" He hesitated. "Years on the bench teach you that weak objections often arrive before strong explanations." Finally, he answered. "Hearsay." I nodded slowly. "Perhaps." Then I looked back down at Daniel's notebook because clipped inside it was something far more significant than the handwritten entry, a printed email. One that appeared to confirm the exact same conversation. And if that email was authentic, everything Victoria had said since entering my courtroom was about to collapse all at once. The moment I unfolded the printed email clipped inside Daniel Mercer's notebook, I stopped speaking, not because I had reached a conclusion, because years on the bench teach you that there are certain documents you cannot afford to read too quickly. Every word matters, every timestamp matters, every recipient matters. The courtroom remained silent. Victoria Ashcroft stared at the paper in my hands. Her attorney no longer looked confident. For the first time that morning, he wasn't writing notes. He was watching me very closely. That told me everything. I examined the header. The email wasn't anonymous. It wasn't forwarded. It came directly from the company's internal server and had been produced during discovery after a subpoena. Interesting. Very interesting. The sender wasn't Victoria. It was her executive assistant. The recipients included Daniel Mercer, the maintenance coordinator, and one final address belonging to Victoria herself. The subject line read, "Aircraft display, final changes." I began reading. The original instruments should not be discussed with the owner until after the charity event. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. I continued. "If anyone asks, explain that the upgrades were necessary." Interesting, very interesting. Necessary. That single word immediately caught my attention. I looked toward Daniel. Were the upgrades actually necessary? No, Your Honor. Were there any safety issues requiring immediate replacement? Interesting, very interesting. So whoever wrote this email already knew another explanation would have to be given. Daniel nodded. Yes. The spectators exchanged uneasy looks. I kept reading. The next paragraph was even more revealing. The original gyro has significant collector interest. Do not release it until valuation is complete. The room froze. Davolute silence. Nobody moved, whispered. Victoria slowly lowered her eyes. Years on the bench teach you something important. People rarely look away from evidence that helps them. They almost always look away from evidence they recognize. I asked calmly, Miss Ashcroft, did you know the original gyro was being valued? A long pause followed. Then, yes. Interesting. Very interesting. So earlier today, when you testified that you had never seen any attempt to authenticate or value the missing instrument, you already knew it had been sent for valuation. She swallowed. Yes. That single answer changed the hearing completely because this was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a contradiction under oath. The courtroom remained perfectly still. Then Daniel quietly reached into his portfolio once more. I believe this belongs with the email. Interesting. Very interesting. He handed me a small printed spreadsheet. It listed auction inquiries, private collectors, museums, restoration companies. Beside each inquiry was a proposed asking price. $160,000, $175,000, $180,000. Then, one entry highlighted in yellow. Ask potential buyer, $212,000. The spectators gasped. Even Noah looked stunned. I turned toward Victoria. Were you aware someone was attempting to sell property that did not belong to you? No. The answer came quickly, too quickly. Years on the bench teach you that immediate denials deserve careful examination, not suspicion examination. I looked back at Daniel. Who had authority to approve a sale? Daniel answered without hesitation. No one, no one, because the part belonged to Mr. Bennett. Interesting. Very interesting. Then I noticed one final attachment behind the valuation spreadsheet, a chain of internal messages, short, only 4. The final message stopped me. I read it once, then again, because I wanted to be absolutely certain. It read, if Noah starts asking questions, remind him the upgraded equipment is worth more than the original. He'll never know the difference. The courtroom erupted. People whispered openly. One spectator actually covered her mouth. The bailiff called for order twice before the room became quiet again. I slowly looked toward Victoria. The woman who had confidently called me clueless just a few hours earlier no longer resembled the person who walked into my courtroom. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't interrupting. She wasn't laughing. She looked frightened, not because of my questions, because her own company's records were answering them. Then something happened that I did not expect. Victoria stood up, not dramatically, quietly. She looked toward Noah. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she turned back toward me. Your Honor, her voice was completely different now. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the superiority. I need to correct my testimony. The courtroom became absolutely silent. Years on the bench teach you that voluntary corrections rarely happen unless someone realizes the truth can no longer be contained. I nodded. You may. She took a deep breath. I knew the original gyro had been removed. Another pause. I knew it was valuable. The spectators remained frozen. Then she whispered the sentence that changed the entire case. I just never believed Mr. Bennett would be able to prove it. The room fell into complete silence, no whispers, no movement, nothing. I closed the file slowly, because at that moment, the outcome of the lawsuit was no longer the biggest issue before me. Victoria had just admitted far more than she intended. And before anyone left my courtroom, I intended to explain exactly what that meant. I have spent enough years on the bench to know that there is a moment in certain hearings when the case simply stops fighting back. No more excuses, no more carefully crafted explanations, no more confidence. Only the truth. That moment had finally arrived. The courtroom remained silent. Victoria Ashcroft stood motionless. The woman who had walked into my courtroom believing money, influence, and confidence would carry. The day now couldn't bring herself to look across the room. Noah Bennett remained seated exactly as he had been all morning. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating. He simply looked exhausted. That affected me more than anything else I had seen that day. Years on the bench teach you that ordinary people rarely file lawsuits because they enjoy conflict. They file them because they believe they have run out of every other option. I looked down at the evidence one final time: the signed lease agreement, the restoration appraisal, the maintenance logs. The manufacturer records, the authentication requests, the internal company emails, Daniel Mercer's testimony, Victoria's own admissions. Every independent source pointed toward the same conclusion. Not one, not two, every one of them. That matters because a single piece of evidence can be challenged. An entire chain of evidence is much harder to escape. I turned toward Victoria, Mrs. Ashcroft. She slowly raised her head. You admitted knowing the original instrument was removed. Yes. You admitted knowing it had significant collector value. Yes. You admitted believing Mr. Bennett would never be able to prove what happened. Another pause, then quietly, yes. The courtroom remained perfectly still. I continued. Did Mr. Bennett ever authorize you to permanently replace original historical components? No. Did he authorize anyone working for your organization to remove property for valuation? No. Were you ever given ownership of that component? No. Interesting, very interesting. For the first time that day, her answers were simple, direct, and truthful. Years on the bench teach you that honesty often arrives only after every alternative has collapsed. Then I looked toward Noah, Mr. Bennett. He looked up immediately. When your father restored this aircraft with you, why was keeping those original parts so important? He took a long breath before answering. My dad used to tell me, a machine can always be repaired. History can't. The courtroom fell silent. He reached into the worn leather binder he had carried all morning, carefully, almost reverently. He removed an old photograph. It showed a much younger Noah standing beside his father in a small hangar, both of them covered in grease, both smiling. Between them sat the Beechcraft, still unfinished. He handed me the photograph. My father spent 11 years finding original parts. He refused to cut corners. He always said one day I'd pass the airplane to my daughters. His voice cracked for the first time. They'll never know it the way he built it. Nobody spoke, not even Victoria. That is something people often forget about property disputes. Sometimes the most valuable thing being argued over isn't money, it's memory, it's legacy, it's a promise someone made to the people they loved. Then I addressed Victoria one final time. Mrs. Ashcroft, you repeatedly referred to these changes as improvements. She nodded weakly. But improvements are decided by the owner, not by the person temporarily borrowing someone else's property. That distinction mattered enormously. Then I said the sentence that completely changed the atmosphere inside the courtroom. You called me clueless. She immediately lowered her eyes. I remember. I do too. The courtroom remained silent. You believed I didn't understand how wealthy people conduct business. I understand business very well. What I don't misunderstand is ownership. You borrowed an aircraft. You returned a different aircraft, perhaps mechanically better, perhaps technologically newer, but legally and historically, It was no longer the same property Mr. Bennett entrusted to you. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. The words settled over the courtroom like a verdict long before I formally announced one. I entered judgment in favor of Noah Bennett. He was awarded damages for the loss in collector value, restoration costs, expert expenses, allowable court costs, and every other remedy supported by the evidence before me. The record overwhelmingly established that the original component had been removed without authorization and that its historical value was well understood by those involved. Then I looked directly at Victoria. There is one final lesson I'd like you to remember. She looked up slowly. Wealth gives people opportunities. It gives them resources. It gives them choices. But it never gives them permission to rewrite someone else's property rights. Another pause. And it certainly doesn't make a judge clueless. For the first time that entire hearing, Victoria nodded. Not because she agreed with me, because there was nothing left to dispute. As the hearing ended, Noah quietly packed the same worn binder he had carried into court. He stopped beside the witness stand, looked at Daniel Mercer, extended his hand. Daniel shook it. No words, none were necessary. Sometimes integrity arrives late, but when it does, it still matters. Victoria remained seated long after everyone else had begun leaving. The reporters walked out first, then the attorneys, then the spectators. She sat alone for several moments, staring at the empty counsel table where her confidence had slowly disappeared piece by piece. Years later, I still think about that afternoon, not because of the billionaire's family, not because of the value of the aircraft, not because of the headlines the case generated. I remember it because arrogance has a habit of believing it can purchase certainty. It cannot. Money can hire experts. It can build companies. It can buy extraordinary things, but it's never been able to purchase the one thing every courtroom demands equally from every person who enters it: the truth. Victoria believed calling me clueless would make me question my judgment. Instead, it reminded me why judges are taught to trust evidence over confidence. Because confidence can be inherited, influence can be borrowed, money can disappear. But facts have a remarkable way of landing safely every single time.